What's up, everyone? So last week, my team at AWS Amplify released Next.js and Ssr support for the Amplify client libraries. And today I released a new blog post called The Complete Guide to Next.js Authentication. It's actually done pretty well over the last couple of hours, had a few thousand views. So I figured I would also do a video walkthrough of how to kind of get end-to-end authentication working with Next.js. So in this video, we're going to kind of start from scratch, create a new Next app, and we're going to kind of go through adding Ssr authentication, client redirects, server redirects, API authentication. Pretty much everything I go through in this tutorial, we're going to go through in this video. So I hope you enjoy it, and we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and close or minimize this browser window. And here we are. Actually, let me go ahead and open that window in another area on my computer so I can kind of have it as a reference, because I'm literally going to be kind of walking through everything that was there. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and create a new Next app. So what I'm going to do is do npx create Next app, and I'll just kind of copy the command from my tutorial, and we'll call this Next Authentication. And then once we create the Next app, we'll go ahead and change into the directory and install a couple of dependencies. So what we're going to be using for the styling is going to be Emotion. So we'll install that, and we'll also install the main AWS Amplify library as well as the AWS Amplify UI components. So I'm going to use Yarn to do so. So we're going to go ahead and install AWS Amplify React, or AWS Amplify UI React. These are the React UI components. We're installing Emotion for styling, and we're installing the main AWS Amplify library. Okay, so after that's installed, we'll go ahead and initialize a new Amplify project. So we'll say Amplify init. And this will go ahead and kind of kick off a new Next app. And I'll go ahead and just kind of take all of the defaults. And for my AWS Amplify an IAM user here, for my profile, I'll just choose the default. And this is kind of set to a user that I have over there on US East 1. So I'll actually kind of bring this window back in here, because I want to kind of make it clear that I'm really just kind of going through this tutorial and essentially copying, pasting commands. But hopefully in the video walkthrough of us kind of looking through the code, we can go in a little more depth than the tutorial itself. And you'll see after we add the authentication service, after we initialize the project, we're going to add the authentication service, and then we're going to deploy. And then that's really going to be it. From there, we can start writing some client-side code. So I'll go ahead and say Amplify add auth. And here we're just going to kind of take the defaults, which is username, sign up, and sign in, and no advanced settings. If you did want to add Facebook, Google, or some type of OAuth provider, we could kind of do that as well, just by setting a couple of additional properties. But we don't want to do that. We're just kind of doing something basic. So I'm going to run Amplify push, and we're going to have now username, password authentication. And while that's deploying, we'll go ahead and open up the code in our text editor. Now, with the new Ssr support with Amplify, it's pretty cool because you don't really have to do a whole lot different than what we've been doing. The main changes that are happening are part of the library itself. So as long as we kind of go by a couple of small API, new pieces of the API that we're going to go over, then you should be good to go. So the first thing we want to do is configure our Amplify project with Next, and we're going to do that at the root. So we're going to go into pages/_app.js, and we're going to go ahead and import Amplify from AWS Amplify. We're going to import the configuration from here in src/AWS exports. So we're going to need to kind of go up one directory and get that file there. And then we're going to call amplify.configure. And instead of just passing in the config, we're going to spread over the config, and we're going to add a new property called SSR and set that to true. And this is what's going to enable the SSR support on the client. So with this enabled, we can now start doing stuff in server rendered routes as well as in API routes. So I can go ahead and save that. And what we're going to now do is we're going to go back to the doc here, or to the tutorial, and we're going to now create a new profile page. So in the pages directory, we're going to write this code here. So I'm going to go into pages. I'm going to create a new file called profile.js. And here we're going to go ahead and import use state and use effect. We're going to also import the with authenticator and the Amplify sign out components from AWS Amplify UI React. And then we're also going to import auth from AWS Amplify. So this is the auth class itself. We're going to be using the with authenticator to scaffold out the authentication flow. And then we're going to be using the auth class to actually call and get the currently signed in user for us to display user metadata. And then we'll have a function called profile. And then for the default export, we'll wrap the profile in the with authenticator. And here we'll say we're going to return some div. And what we're going to now do here is we're going to go ahead and say we want to get the user, and we're going to have a function to update the user here. We're going to use state, passing in null. And then what we can do here is we can say if there is a user, we can say hello user.username. And the way we're going to get that user is we're going to call update user and use effect. And I can actually just copy and paste some code from the tutorial, so make this a little faster. So it's just going to be this code right here. We're going to call auth.currentAuthenticated_user, and this is going to go ahead and check to see if there is a signed in user. If there is, we're just going to log it out, and we're going to call setUser. And then we'll also add the Amplify sign out button here. And this is kind of all we really need to kind of get up and running with the basic profile page. This is going to, if you navigate here and you're not signed up or signed in, it will scaffold out that authentication flow for you. If you are signed in, it'll just show you a greeting. And I think I need to update this from update user from set user to update user. Okay, cool. So we can now test this out. We can say run npm run dev. And I think the last thing we want to do is actually go ahead and add some navigation so we can actually navigate here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this code here, and then we'll walk through it. And this is going to be back in src, it's going to be pages/_app.js. So we're importing the link component from NextLink. We're importing the CSS from Emotion. We're still calling amplify.configure, passing in the config with SSR true, just as we did before. And instead of just returning the component, what we're going to be doing is returning like some nav as well as the component here, the main component. I think that's about it. So we can go ahead and test this out. We'll go to localhost 3000. And here we have our basic Next app. And if we go to profile, we'll see that we have a sign-in flow. And what I'll also do is I'll copy the styling here because I want it to match the rest of the Next styling. So I can go into styles and just paste in the root styling for this component. And when we go back, it should be blue. So let's go ahead and create a new account. And this is going to send an MFA password or MFA code to my email address. So I will go check my email now. Go ahead and enter this code here. And now when we sign in, we should have our greeting here, and we should be able to kind of navigate back and forth. So now we have authentication working in our next app. Now let's start working with some more interesting stuff. So what we want to do is access the user session in an SSR route. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new page called protected.js. So I'll just, I guess, go to my command line. Actually, we'll just go to the project itself. We'll say protected.js. And then here is where we're going to go ahead and add that new code. So this is going to be what we're going to be using. So I'll kind of copy and paste this and we'll walk through it. So what we're doing is we're importing the with SSR context utility from AWS Amplify. And this allows us to destructure an SSR aware auth or API component from AWS Amplify or data store. And in this case, we're using the auth class. And then in the component itself, we only have a few lines of code. We have a prop coming in that is an authenticated Boolean, and we have a username. If the user is not authenticated, we're just going to return an H1. If they are authenticated, we're going to return a greeting with their username. Now, the way that we pass this in is using get server-side props. So let's take a look at that function. In the first line here, we take the context and we destructure auth from with SSR context, passing in the context. So using this context, we're able to get the user session that was passed in from the actual application itself. And on the client, we're working with local storage, but here we're actually working with cookies. So we have the session information taken out of the context, and we're able to now use it here. So now when we call auth.currentAuthenticated_user, we actually get the user here in a server-side route. And what we're going to then do, if they are authenticated, we're going to say authenticated is true, and then we're going to return their username to the client. If they are not, we're just going to return authenticated as false. So that's kind of all that's going on here. But what we do need to do is add a new link. So we have this new protected route. So let's go into app.js and copy this. And here this is going to be protected. And we're going to say to /protected. And we'll save that. And we should be now ready to test it out. So you see we have our new protected route here. So if we click there, we're going to see hello from SSR route. That means this is working. And you're also going to notice that if we go to our terminal, that we have that user session completely logged out here to the terminal. So we have all this metadata. The attributes is kind of interesting because here you can get the user sub, which is their unique identifier. You get their email address, their phone number, all that stuff. So let's test this out and sign out and then try to access it and see what happens. So we sign out. We go now to this protected route and we see not authenticated. We go back to profile. We sign in. And we try it again. And what we should see is the message saying hello from SSR route. So everything is working. So that's SSR, basic SSR authentication or getting user access in a server rendered route. Let's now check out an API route. So here we're going to create a new page called check user, or a new API called check user in the API pages directory. And we'll walk through this code as well in just a moment. So we're going to have check user.js. And what we're going to now need to do in any API route, we're also going to need to run amplify.configure passing in the config, because these API routes are going to be needing to have their own SSR true configuration set. We also are importing the SSR context like we did in the other component that we worked with, because we're also going to be destructuring the auth class within this function, passing in the request, and then we're also going to be getting that user session off of the request. So very similar to how we did in the server rendered route. Then we're calling auth.currentAuthenticated_user. If there is a user, we're just returning the user's username in the response just to kind of show that this is working. If it's not, we're going to return an error, essentially, or basically a user is being set to null. So we know if there is no user that they're not authenticated. And we can save this, and we should be able to go ahead and check this out by going to /API/check_user. And we see that user is Dabbit3. And if we go back and sign out, and we try that again, we see that the user is null. So zoom in a little bit so you can see that. And then if we go back, oops, looks like I'm zoomed in a little too much. We'll go ahead and sign back in. Okay, cool. So we have authentication working. We have it working on the client. We also have API routes being able to access the user, and SSR routes. So the next thing we might want to do is look at how to do stuff like redirects. So I have some code here for a client-side redirect. And this is very similar to what we were doing already in the protected, let's see which route we were doing that in. In the protected route, where we're basically having, some way to kind of like check if there is a user, and if there is, we're doing something, and if not, we're doing something else. And in this case, we're basically going to be checking if there is a user. If there is, we're just going to allow them to see the page. If they're not there, we're going to then redirect them to another client page. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we're going to create a new page called protectedclientroute.js. And we import useState and useEffect from React. We import auth from AWS Amplify, and we import useRouter from Next.js. We create a user, and we set that to null using useState. We then create a reference to the router using the useRouter hook. And then in the useEffect hook, this is kind of where everything is going on, and we'll walk through that in just a second. But finally, when we actually are ready to return something from this component, if there is no user, we just return null until this useEffect hook finishes. And if there is a user, we're going to return some HTML, hello user.username. If they're not, though, then this catch block is going to catch if they're not authenticated. And we're going to say we want to do router.push, and we're going to set the route that we'd like them to go to. In this case, we're saying, okay, if they're not authenticated, let's redirect them to authenticate by redirecting them to the profile page. So we have that working, and now we just need to have a link to it. So I'm going to go back to app.js, and we're going to add one more link. And here we have the /protected client route, and we have the protected client route as the route name. And we're going to go back to our app, and we're going to try this out. So we have now a few different routes. We have our profile, we have our SSR protected route, and we also have our protected client route. And you see when we go from here, we see SSR route, we go to the client route, we say hello from client route. So everything seems to be working. The next thing we might want to do is just test that redirect. So let's try to click on protected client route now. We see that we're automatically redirected. We go to protected, that doesn't work. We go to protected client, that redirects us now to this page. So the last thing we might want to do is how to do a redirect on the server, because I think that's one of the most interesting things that you can do with SSR is this idea of SSR redirects, because when you're hitting a server rendered page and you're able to either render HTML or not render HTML, it's a little more secure, because even if we are doing a client-side redirect, theoretically they could inspect the element or something like that, or they could kind of debug and maybe see what's rendering. But if we're doing a server-side redirect, we're not rendering any HTML at all. We're just saying, okay, if they're not authenticated, we're redirecting them. And if they are authenticated, we'll then serve this HTML. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into protected.js and we're going to make a few updates. So I'll go ahead and copy the code. Whoops. Go ahead and copy this code and we'll go back to protected.js. And what we're going to say is we're importing that with SSR context, and then the protected route is actually extremely small now. It's just 3 lines of code. We're just going to return hello username from SSR route because we're just 100% sure if this is rendering, then they are authenticated. And the way that we're going to make that happen is in the get server side props function. And here again, we're destructuring auth using with SSR context, passing in the request, which is going to get the user session. And then we're going to then say auth.currentAuthenticated_user. If this errors, then this is where the redirect is happening. If it does not error, we're just going to pass in, these same props as we did before, authenticated and the username. But if they are not authenticated, we're going to then call, we're going to basically do response.write_head, and we're going to set the code as 302 and the location is /profile. And then we're also going to return props because this is kind of what the Next.js API requires you to do. If you don't do this, it will return an error. Even though we're not going to be returning anything because we're not rendering this page, we're still just going to do this just to go around having that error. So what's going to happen now is if we are authenticated, we're going to see this component. If we're not going to see anything. We're just going to be redirected on the server. So we don't have to change our navigation because this is already done. So before, when we went to protected, we just saw a message. Now when we go here, we should be redirected back to our profile page, which is happening. So now let's test this out by signing in. And we're going to go to our protected SSR routes. And there we go. It's now working again. The client route is still protected and our API route is still protected. So the interesting thing that you can do at this point is, in the protected routes, in these API routes and SSR routes, having access to the user, you can do stuff like make authentication requests to other APIs. You can actually, create really interesting API routes themselves to be based on that user state. And getting this up and running based on what we had before with Amplify, there's not a lot of change. The main change is instead of just using the auth class directly from Amplify, we're using the with SSR context whenever we're working in an SSR or API route. That's really about it. And then setting SSR to true. Also make sure you're on the most recent version of AWS Amplify, and you should be good to go. So yeah, this is the tutorial. If you're interested, in learning more and you haven't seen the tutorial, check it out. The code is going to be linked into this YouTube video, but it's also linked from this blog post here. So all of the code is located here, Next.js authentication with AWS. You can actually deploy a slightly nicer version of this project by just following these directions here. Git clone, changing the directory, amplify init, amplify push, and then you're ready to go. All right, so that was it. That wasn't very long. Hopefully you followed along and learned a little something. So thanks for checking this out. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching.